The lights flickered across American living rooms on the evening of January 17, 1961, as millions gathered to witness something remarkable. A five-star general who had commanded the Allied forces that crushed Nazi tyranny now stood before the nation to deliver a warning so profound that it would echo through the decades to come. President Dwight David Eisenhower, his face weathered by the weight of leadership and the knowledge of war's true cost, spoke with the authority of a man who had seen empires rise and fall, who understood the machinery of conflict from the inside, and who now felt compelled to sound an alarm about the very nation he had served for 40 years. In that farewell address, broadcast from the Oval Office, Eisenhower coined a phrase that would become embedded in the American consciousness: the military-industrial complex. He warned that this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in the American experience, that its total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, was felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist, he cautioned, urging citizens to guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought. What Eisenhower understood, perhaps better than any civilian leader of his era, was that America had crossed a threshold, that the nation had built an economic architecture that would fundamentally alter the relationship between warfare, profit, and national policy in ways that most Americans could not yet comprehend. This was not the paranoid fantasy of a conspiracy theorist, but the sober assessment of a military commander who had witnessed firsthand how industrial capacity, financial power, and strategic decision-making had become inseparably intertwined. Before you move forward, let me ask you to stay with this story until the very end, because what unfolds in the years following Eisenhower's warning reveals patterns that continue to shape American foreign policy, economic priorities, and the relationship between democracy and concentrated power to this very day. The journey we're about to take together will connect dots that have been deliberately obscured, not through wild speculation but through careful examination of declassified documents, economic data, and the testimony of those who participated in these decisions. And when we reach the conclusion, I want you to tell me where you're watching from, what city and country, because these patterns aren't confined to American borders. They represent a transformation in how modern states navigate the tension between security and the temptations of perpetual conflict. The story of Vietnam, as you'll come to understand, wasn't simply about communism versus democracy. It was about what happens when the machinery of war becomes so profitable, so embedded in the economic structure of a superpower, that peace itself becomes a threat to prosperity. To understand how America found itself mired in the jungles of Southeast Asia by the mid-1960s, we must first return to the economic landscape that emerged from the ashes of World War II. The United States stood alone among the great powers with its industrial capacity not only intact but massively expanded. While European factories lay in ruins and Asian cities smoldered, American production lines hummed with unprecedented output, churning out everything from automobiles to aircraft with an efficiency that made the nation the undisputed economic colossus of the post-war world. The GI Bill sent millions of veterans to college, creating an educated middle class with aspirations that required sustained prosperity to fulfill. Suburbs sprawled across former farmland as developers like William Levitt mass-produced housing for families eager to claim their piece of the American dream. By 1950, unemployment had dropped below 2 million, and the United States wasn't merely a strong economy but the strongest economy the world had ever known, accounting for roughly half of global manufacturing output. This was the golden age that Americans remember with nostalgia, the era of chrome-finned Cadillacs, backyard barbecues, and a confidence that bordered on invincibility. Yet beneath this shining surface, forces were already at work that would reshape the nation's relationship with war itself, transforming military conflict from a terrible necessity into a permanent feature of economic planning. The Korean War, which erupted in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, served as the prototype for what was to come. Within months, the United States military budget exploded from a post-war low of $13.5 billion to $50 billion by the close of 1950. This wasn't merely an increase. It represented a fundamental restructuring of the American economy onto a war footing that would never fully President Truman declared a state of emergency in December 1950, granting him sweeping executive powers to control prices, raise taxes, and direct industrial production toward military ends. The Economic Stabilization Agency immediately intervened in corporate pricing decisions, while inflation soared as citizens and companies hoarded goods in anticipation of shortages. Steel capacity expanded significantly, aluminum production more than doubled, petroleum refining increased, and thousands of new oil wells were drilled. Long-distance pipelines were designated as defense projects, qualifying for tax amortization privileges that made military-related infrastructure exceptionally profitable. What emerged from this mobilization was something entirely new in American history, a permanent class of corporations whose prosperity depended not on consumer goods but on government contracts for weapons, aircraft, and military systems. Companies like General Electric, Boeing, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, and General Dynamics grew into industrial behemoths, employing tens of thousands. By 2011, the 100 largest defense contractors sold hundreds of billions in arms and services annually, with the top 10 accounting for more than half that sum. These weren't anomalies, but the mature expression of the system that began taking shape during the Korean conflict. The Korean War did more than jumpstart the link between business and government. It created a feedback loop wherein corporate profits depended on sustained military spending, which in turn required ongoing threats to justify the budgets. Defense plans and the money they generated became woven into the fabric of regional economies, creating congressional districts whose representatives had every incentive to support military appropriations regardless of strategic necessity. When Eisenhower warned about unwarranted influence in 1961, he spoke from intimate knowledge of how this system operated. He had witnessed the pressure applied by contractors, the lobbying efforts, the revolving door between Pentagon positions and defense corporations. The total influence wasn't merely economic but political and spiritual, shaping how Americans saw their role in the world. Into this landscape walked John Fitzgerald Kennedy in January 1961. Kennedy brought advisors convinced that American power could be rationalized and deployed with precision. Chief among these was Robert Strange McNamara, Secretary of Defense, whose background in systems analysis shaped his approach to warfare. After World War II, he joined Ford Motor Company with other analysts known as the Whiz Kids. He used quantitative methods to streamline operations and boost efficiency. Kennedy believed that the same rationalism could be applied to national defense. Between 1961 and 1968, McNamara introduced systems analysis into military decision-making, asserting that war could be rationalized and won through quantitative management. Vietnam became his proving ground, with progress measured not by political realities but by numbers: bomb tonnage, villages controlled, body counts. Success was to be quantified, charted, graphed. The Kennedy administration implemented flexible response, increasing conventional military capabilities and requiring greater procurement of helicopters, small arms, transport aircraft, opening lucrative markets for contractors. The financial dimension was profound. Wall Street had learned during Korea that defense stocks performed exceptionally well during military engagement. Investment portfolios increasingly favored military-industrial companies. Banks profited from lending to contractors expanding production. The fractional reserve banking system amplified credit during military buildups, as defense industries borrowed to finance factories, workers, and weapons development. Military engagement became tightly linked to economic performance, with defense equities rising on news of escalation. By 1963, the architecture was complete: a massive military establishment, a defense industry dependent on continuous contracts, financial markets structured to reward military spending, and policymakers convinced that American force could solve global problems. All that was needed was a conflict significant enough to justify sustained engagement. Southeast Asia, with its strategic shipping lanes and volatile political landscape, provided such an opportunity. The domino theory supplied ideological cover, but beneath it lay economic calculations regarding markets and geopolitical influence. The spark came in the Gulf of Tonkin in August 1964. The destroyers, Maddox and Turner Joy, conducting intelligence operations in contested waters, reported torpedo attacks. The first incident likely occurred. The second appears to have been largely imaginary. Nevertheless, President Johnson used the reports to request sweeping authorization from Congress. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution, rushed through in an atmosphere of urgency, became a blank check for war. What the public didn't know was that escalation had been planned for months. Target lists were prepared, retaliatory measures recommended, and draft resolution language written well before the Tonkin events. The incidents provided political cover for actions already determined. Soon, sustained bombing campaigns began, followed by massive troop deployments. The machinery Eisenhower warned about was fully engaged. Defense contractors prospered as production surged, stock prices climbed, dividends flowed. Thousands of subcontractors supplied parts, forming an economic ecosystem spanning the nation. Communities became dependent on Vietnam-related jobs, making opposition to the war economically risky. Banks financed expansion through loans secured against future contracts. Inflationary pressures, which would trouble the U.S. throughout the 1970s, were rooted in this deficit-funded war. McNamara's systems analysis, however, failed to capture the political will of an enemy fighting for reunification. The metrics looked promising, but the war dragged on. Bombs fell by the millions, yet supply lines remained. Body counts soared, yet victory remained elusive. By 1968, McNamara resigned, recognizing that some conflicts defy quantification. The promises of 1961, the belief that American power could be applied with precision and withdrawn after achieving limited objectives, had dissolved into the quagmire Eisenhower foresaw. The military-industrial complex found its fullest expression in Vietnam, a conflict sustained by corporate profit, political calculation, and bureaucratic inertia. Americans were told they were defending freedom, yet were underwriting a war that enriched contractors while devastating Southeast Asia. This was the untold story, obscured by rhetoric and only revealed when documents surfaced and participants spoke. By 1967, America had become so deeply entangled in Vietnam that the war no longer represented a foreign policy decision subject to rational debate but had evolved into a fixture of the national economy, a permanent condition generating profits for some and death for others. Defense budgets had ballooned beyond anything imaginable just a decade earlier, with military contractors expanding production at rates that required massive infusions of capital from Wall Street's largest financial institutions. The Bank of America, the largest banking institution in the United States, found itself financing the very companies that manufactured the helicopters, bombs, and chemical defoliants being deployed across Southeast Asia. Investment portfolios held by pension funds, insurance companies, and private wealth managers became heavily weighted toward military-industrial stocks, creating a perverse incentive structure wherein the financial security of millions of Americans depended on the continuation of a conflict that was consuming their sons. This was the ultimate expression of what Eisenhower had warned against, a total influence that had woven warfare so thoroughly into the fabric of prosperity that peace itself became an economic threat. The machinery was operating exactly as designed, converting appropriations into profits, losses into dividends, and strategic ambiguity into sustained revenue streams for corporations that had learned to thrive on perpetual conflict. It was in this atmosphere that Baltimore businessman Henry Niles, board chairman of Baltimore Life Insurance Company, took an action that revealed the moral crisis brewing within the business community itself. In September 1967, Niles contacted fellow business leaders, asking them to sign a letter to President Johnson, urging him to end American involvement in Vietnam. This wasn't the predictable activism of clergymen or student protesters, but something far more significant. Executives who had built their careers within the capitalist system were now publicly questioning the economic model that had enriched them. 83 business leaders initially agreed to endorse Niles's letter, though many others refused, fearing they would be perceived as communist sympathizers or unpatriotic. Americans in a climate where dissent was often equated with treason, the formation of business executives moved for Vietnam peace, known as BEM, represented a fracture in the consensus that had sustained the war through its darkest years. Harold Willans, president of Factory Equipment Supply Company of Los Angeles, co-chaired the organization with Niles, explaining to reporters that BEM was growing much faster than expected because business leaders increasingly recognized that the war's costs extended far beyond the battlefield. Urban decay, inflation, social unrest, and the diversion of resources from domestic needs could all be traced to a single cause: the nation's spending for the war in Vietnam. By March 1968, Niles decided to escalate the pressure through what he called a kind of economic boycott, targeting corporations that were profiting most egregiously from the conflict. In a letter sent to Louis Lundborg, chairman of the board of Bank of America, Niles noted that the bank's financing of defense contractors made it complicit in sustaining a war that had lost both moral legitimacy and strategic coherence. This represented an extraordinary moment. Business leaders attempting to leverage market mechanisms not to enhance profits but to force ethical accountability onto institutions that had become indifferent to the human consequences of their lending decisions. The fact that such efforts ultimately failed to halt the war doesn't diminish their significance as evidence that even within the corridors of corporate power, some individuals retained enough moral clarity to recognize that what was good for defense contractors wasn't necessarily good for America, yet the machinery continued its operation, indifferent to dissent from within or opposition from without, propelled by momentum that seemed unstoppable. The economic consequences of Vietnam were beginning to manifest in ways that would define American life for the next decade and beyond. Inflation, which had remained relatively modest through the early 1960s, began accelerating as war-related deficit spending pumped money into an economy already operating near capacity. In 1964, the Consumer Price Index increased by just 1.2%, but by 1966 it had jumped to 3.4%, reaching 4.7% in 1968 and 6.1% in 1969. This wasn't coincidental but the predictable result of financing a war through debt rather than taxation, a political calculation that allowed Johnson to pursue both his Great Society domestic programs and military escalation in Vietnam without forcing Americans to choose between them. The Federal Reserve, recognizing the inflationary pressures building within the system, attempted to tighten monetary policy in 1966, but the forces unleashed by wartime spending proved too powerful to contain through conventional tools. Military contractors expanded their inventories and their demands for raw materials and personnel, creating shortages that drove prices upward across entire sectors of the economy. Wholesale prices for metals increased by 9.2%, while machinery and equipment rose by 11.2% as defense production consumed resources that would otherwise have been available for civilian purposes. Tightened labor markets, exacerbated by the military draft pulling young men out of the workforce, led to accelerated wage increases that further fueled the inflationary spiral. Working-class families bore a double burden that the architects of escalation had never acknowledged in their cost-benefit analysis. Their sons were drafted to fight in jungles 10,000 miles from home, while their savings eroded under inflation rates that would reach double digits by the mid-1970s. McNamara's systems analysis had quantified tons of bombs and body counts but somehow failed to measure this. The betrayal of ordinary Americans who had believed their government when it spoke of defending freedom and containing communism. The prosperity that had seemed so secure in the early 1960s now revealed itself as contingent, vulnerable to policy decisions made in Washington. Boardrooms where strategic objectives became indistinguishable from corporate earnings projections. From 1965 to 1969, actual gross national product exceeded potential capacity. The unemployment rate dropped to 3.5%, and manufacturing facilities operated at capacity utilization rates in the high 80s, creating an appearance of health that masked the structural damage being inflicted on the economy's long-term stability. When the war finally ended, the United States would face a decade of stagflation, a toxic combination of economic stagnation and high inflation that defied conventional economic theory and devastated the middle class. The media's role in sustaining the war deserves particular scrutiny, not because journalists were uniformly complicit but because the structural relationships between news organizations, advertisers, and defense contractors created conflicts of interest that inevitably shaped coverage. Corporate consolidation had concentrated media ownership into a handful of conglomerates with unprecedented power to reach billions of people with their messaging. General Electric, which owned NBC, simultaneously manufactured components for weapons systems deployed in Vietnam, creating an obvious tension between journalistic objectivity and corporate profitability. Raytheon interlocked with the New York Times, Lockheed Martin with the Washington Post and Gannett USA Today, and Caterpillar with the Tribune Company, owner of the Chicago Tribune and Los Angeles Times. These weren't casual business relationships, but deeply embedded connections that raised fundamental questions about whether news organizations could credibly report on a war when their parent companies or major advertisers profited from its continuation. The revolving door between Pentagon positions and defense contractor executive suites had an analog in the media sphere, where retired generals became paid consultants for networks covering military operations, providing analysis colored by institutional loyalties and financial incentives. If you're finding value in this historical examination, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss future content. I'd also love to know where you're watching from, so drop a comment with your city and country. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who need to understand these patterns. Embedded reporting, a practice that would reach its fullest expression in later conflicts, had its origins in Vietnam coverage that increasingly resembled sports commentary rather than critical journalism. Todd Gitlin noted at a Media at War conference that embeddedness has a built-in swerve toward propaganda because an embedded reporter is on the team, likening television war coverage to sporting events that entertained rather than informed. The major television networks relied excessively on the Pentagon and Bush administration for information, a pattern that had been established during Vietnam and would persist through subsequent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. Opponents of war were chronically underrepresented in media coverage compared to pro-military viewpoints, and networks had even been known to clear on-air talent with the Department of Defense, ensuring that dissenting voices faced structural barriers to reaching mass audiences. This wasn't a conspiracy in the conventional sense, but the predictable operation of institutions whose survival depended on maintaining relationships with power and avoiding confrontations that might threaten access or advertising revenue. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 shattered the carefully constructed narrative that the Johnson administration had been selling to the American public. For months, government officials had engaged in an optimistic public relations campaign, assuring citizens that the war was being won, that enemy capabilities had been degraded, and that victory lay just beyond the horizon. When communist forces launched coordinated attacks on cities and military installations across South Vietnam during the Tet holiday, the discrepancy between official rhetoric and ground reality became impossible to conceal. Although American and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the bad offensive and inflicted heavy casualties on the attackers, the psychological impact on American public opinion proved devastating. The number of poll respondents who thought sending troops to Vietnam was a mistake crossed a critical threshold in February 1968, not because media reporting misrepresented the offensive as a military defeat, but because the Johnson administration's own optimistic predictions had set expectations that reality demolished. The credibility gap, a term that had emerged to describe the growing distance between official statements and verifiable facts, widened into a chasm that would never fully close. Television images of fighting in the streets of Saigon, of enemy forces temporarily occupying the American embassy compound, contradicted every assurance that progress was being made. President Johnson's approval ratings plummeted as Americans realized they had been systematically misled about the war's trajectory. The Tet Offensive didn't change the war's dynamics so much as it revealed them, exposing the futility of a strategy based on attrition against an enemy willing to absorb losses that would have broken any Western military. McNamara, the systems analyst who had promised that quantitative management could rationalize warfare, had already resigned by this point, broken by the recognition that his metrics were measuring nothing of strategic value. The data had looked promising, roads cleared and villages controlled, yet the enemy remained capable of launching nationwide coordinated attacks that caught American forces by surprise. Body counts reached staggering numbers, yet the insurgency continued. Bombing tonnage exceeded all explosives dropped in World War II, yet supply lines remained open. The fundamental assumption underlying American strategy, that superior firepower and industrial capacity would inevitably produce victory, had been tested to destruction against an opponent for whom the conflict represented not a foreign policy objective but an existential struggle for national reunification. What the American people didn't yet know, what wouldn't be revealed until Daniel Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times in June 1971, was that the deception ran far deeper than optimistic assessments and inflated progress reports. The Pentagon Papers, a 7,000-page classified study commissioned by McNamara himself in 1967, documented a pattern of systematic lying that extended across 4 presidential administrations. Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson had each contributed to escalating the conflict, often disregarding intelligence assessments that contradicted their policy preferences and consistently downplaying risks while overstating progress. The papers revealed that the Truman administration had provided military aid to French colonial forces fighting Vietnamese independence movements, establishing direct American involvement far earlier than publicly acknowledged. Eisenhower's 1954 decision to prevent communist takeover and undermine North Vietnam contradicted his public posture of limited engagement. Kennedy had transformed what officials privately described as a limited-risk gamble into a broad commitment that bound his successors to escalation. Johnson had engaged in covert warfare planning throughout 1964, a full year before publicly disclosing the depth of American involvement. The documents exposed how government officials consistently presented assessments to the public and Congress that sharply contradicted classified reports and internal communications. One particularly damning revelation concerned intelligence analyses showing that American bombing campaigns would not stop North Vietnamese support for Viet Cong forces, yet bombing was ordered anyway, not because strategists believed it would work, but because doing nothing was politically untenable. The gap between what policymakers knew internally and what they told the American people constituted outright deception, a culture of secrecy that fostered distrust between citizens and government institutions that would persist for generations. President Johnson had repeatedly told Americans that the United States was winning and that there was light at the end of the tunnel, even when his own advisors warned of potential quagmire. McNamara, who commissioned the study partly because he feared future generations wouldn't understand the rationale behind government decisions, was himself complicit in presenting an overly optimistic picture that bore little resemblance to reality. The Supreme Court's decision in New York Times Co. versus United States, permitting publication of the Pentagon Papers over government objections, represented a watershed moment for press freedom and government accountability. The documents legitimized dissent by proving that critics who had been dismissed as unpatriotic or uninformed had been correct in their skepticism about official narratives. Congressional investigations, particularly those led by Senator William Fulbright, began exposing the mechanisms through which executive power had been exercised without meaningful legislative oversight. In the summer of 1970, Congress formally rescinded the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, revoking the authorization that had served as legal justification for military action in Vietnam. Yet even after that revocation, Congress continued appropriating funds to conduct the war for another 2 years, demonstrating how difficult it was to halt momentum once institutional and economic interests had aligned behind continued engagement. American forces finally withdrew from Vietnam in 1973, leaving behind a conflict that would conclude 2 years later with communist forces taking Saigon and reunifying the country under Hanoi's control. That same year, Congress enacted the War Powers Resolution over President Nixon's veto, attempting to limit executive branch power to wage war without congressional authorization. The resolution required presidents to consult with Congress before introducing forces into hostilities and mandated withdrawal within 60 days, unless Congress granted explicit authorization. Whether this legislation meaningfully constrained executive power remains debatable, as subsequent presidents have found ways to circumvent its requirements. but it represented Congress's attempt to reclaim authority that had been ceded through decades of Cold War deference to executive prerogatives. The legacy of Vietnam extended far beyond the 58,000 American lives lost and the millions of Vietnamese casualties. The war transformed America's relationship with government authority, military power, and the narratives used to justify foreign interventions. Trust between citizens and institutions crumbled under revelations of systematic deception. The economic consequences, particularly the inflationary spiral triggered by war-related deficit spending, devastated middle-class prosperity and created conditions for the stagflation that would define the 1970s. Most fundamentally, Vietnam demonstrated what Eisenhower had warned about, that when the machinery of war becomes embedded in economic structures, when corporate profits depend on military spending, and when financial markets reward escalation while punishing restraint, then the misplaced power he feared has indeed risen. The patterns established during Vietnam didn't disappear with American withdrawal but evolved and matured through subsequent conflicts. The defense contractors whose stocks soared during the 1960s grew into even larger conglomerates by the 21st century. The media consolidation that created conflicts of interest during Vietnam coverage intensified until just a handful of corporations controlled the vast majority of news outlets. The revolving door between Pentagon positions and corporate executive suites spun faster, with retired generals and admirals routinely joining boards of companies they had awarded contracts to while in uniform. The financial mechanisms that profited from warfare became more sophisticated, with private equity firms acquiring defense contractors and Wall Street's investment banks structuring complex financing arrangements that made military spending an ever more lucrative sector for capital. What Americans learned from Vietnam, if they learned anything at all, is that the most dangerous threats to democratic governance don't always originate with foreign adversaries, but can emerge from domestic institutions when profit motives colonize national security decision-making. Eisenhower understood this with the clarity that comes from having commanded armies and witnessed how industrial capacity shapes strategic thinking. His warning wasn't about conspiracies or cabals, but about structural incentives, about what happens when corporations employ millions of workers whose livelihoods depend on military contracts, when congressional districts become economically dependent on defense installations, and when financial markets learn to price geopolitical instability as investment opportunity. The total influence he described, economic, political, spiritual, operates not through centralized control but through distributed interests that align spontaneously around the perpetuation of conflict. The soldiers who fought in Vietnam weren't betrayed by their fellow citizens or by protesters who questioned the war's legitimacy, but by a system that sent them to die for objectives that had more to do with corporate balance sheets than national security. They served with courage and honor, believing they were defending freedom and containing totalitarianism, while defense contractors tallied profits and investment bankers structured financing deals. The real betrayal lay in using patriotism as cover for economic exploitation, in wrapping avarice in the flag and presenting corporate interests as national interests. Until Americans demand accountability from institutions that profit from warfare, until financial transparency becomes prerequisite for military appropriations, and until Congress reclaims its constitutional authority over decisions of war and peace, the patterns revealed by Vietnam will repeat with predictable regularity. The question isn't whether American power should be used to defend genuine threats to freedom and democracy, but whether citizens can distinguish between legitimate security needs and manufactured crises designed to justify perpetual military spending. Eisenhower believed that an alert and knowledgeable citizenry could provide that discernment, could guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. Whether we've proven him right remains the most important question confronting American democracy today.